Taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Oh, taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall always be on my lips. My soul shall glory in the Lord, for He has been so good to me. Taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Oh, taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord, Glorify the Lord with me. Together let us all praise His name. I called the Lord and He answered me. From all my troubles He set me free. Taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Oh, taste and see, taste and see the goodness of the Lord.
This is our final Sunday with King David. I'm sure that he is moving on to greener pastures, but seriously, our time with him is now concluded, and he must head east toward the land of the pirates. This Sunday will be a great opportunity to sort of recap the past 7 weeks of glimpses into David's stories and adventures, how his relationship with God was strengthened through trials and victories, sin and regret, forgiveness and restitution. David's story is the beginning of a monarchy that eventually culminates in the everlasting monarchy of the King of Kings, the Lord Jesus Christ. David's story begins with a humble shepherd boy who is so insignificant that he isn't even invited to a family dinner where his brothers are to be presented before the prophet Samuel. Sounds strangely similar to Jesus' story, as his life begins in a lowly manger in a barn where the sheep were fed. There is no pomp for these future kings. God's way is certainly different from ours. One cannot go a single week without seeing some news of the royal family in England. I think sometimes we hear news of the royal births in real time. Or consider the epic and timeless Disney story of Simba the Royal Lion Cub and the adventures and tragedies of this young lion king that have kept both young and old entertained for decades. It seems to be in our nature to seek adventure, to have heroic battles between good and evil, light and darkness, justice for the oppressed, the little guy getting the break. Our libraries are chock full of great literary works. Netflix can hardly keep pace with our insatiable appetite for adventure. The past few weeks, we've heard story after story of Olympic athletes who beat the odds and made the sacrifices to finally compete in their sport at the highest level. Well, this summer, we wanted to present the story of David and a few of his adventures and trials, hopefully in a way that makes him more realistic and human. David is not just a name we hear occasionally in a church or sing about in a hymn at Christmas. We are all created in the image and likeness of God. This means that not only do we resemble God in looks and form, but we also share God's feelings and emotions. Of course, God knows we crave adventure and justice. It's just in our spiritual DNA. The story of David and Israel is our story too. Life can be complex. It is often a confusing mix of political, cultural, and personal events and tragedies. It can also be the very definition of adventure. So, with all this in mind, let's revisit the stories we have experienced over the past 7 weeks.
Oh, it's so good to see you. I like this.
Thank you. Thank you. And we don't know what color your eyes are yet, so I guess that would be a mystery for a long time.
Absolutely.
Well, it is great to have you back with us.
It's an absolute privilege to be here in this fine establishment over this summer, sharing my stories. Not only the ones I'm proud of, but even the ones I'm not very proud of. But thank you, regardless, for inviting me here. This has been an absolute blast. Actually, truth be known, as we reenacted each and every story, I was reminded of how God's grace carried me through it all. I certainly would not have survived even one of those events if it was not for God's mercy and favor. I really did have quite the life of adventure. Looking back and recounting the events puts things into perspective, to say. God was so very patient with me, and I can see God's hand in, well, all of it now. As a matter of fact, I even wrote a song about this same very thing. When people say that it's easier to express your feelings in song, I'm kind of right. You guys call this song the 23rd Psalm, right?
Oh, yeah. Very familiar to us.
I call it God Saved My... We'll go with your title. I mean, I really messed up life. It's bad. Maybe we should, stick with you, your title of how that went. The song, though, is basically about how God continually rescued me from my enemies and inevitably from myself. How God continually is always giving me a do-over. A fresh start every day. Sometimes probably every couple minutes. God's grace is just awesome. That is the reason I included the phrase, "He restores my soul," in the lyrics of my song. It literally means I get another chance. And another. And another.
Well, we're glad that you mentioned that song. A 23rd Psalm is something that we use and incorporate in our worship so many different times.
I don't blame you. It's a good one.
It's in your top 5. Yeah. And this particular summer, man, we've enjoyed being part of your story and hearing your reflections upon them as we go. Being part of those stories has been great.
It's so much fun. But I know, and you know, but in case your congregation needs to be reminded, don't know why, but just in case, my stories are featured in the Bible for a multitude of reasons. But the main reason is for you, and for you, and for you, and well, for all of you.
Well, I was mentioning to the folks earlier before you arrived, maybe your bus was late. I didn't see you come in.
Traffic.
So, it can be
Brutal.
It's, God gave us these stories about you and your adventures and the people surrounding you, so that we could see ourselves in those stories in that text. And did it in such a way that we can recall now how God's grace carries each of us through different kinds of trials and adventures. Perhaps we haven't literally slayed a giant, but they are types of giants in our lives. They might be physical obstacles, or they might be financial crises, or they might be some kind of health crisis or relationship difficulty. All those kind of things can be giants in our lives.
For sure.
So your story reveals to us how God's grace to us gives us the ability to stand up in the face of adversity and be able to even stand up to ridicule sometimes. God gives us tools and weapons, from what I read in your stories, that we will use to get the job done. And God also promises that we won't have to do it all alone. So, question for you that came to mind, if we were doing a talk show, it'd be like Sarah from Nebraska writes, is there a particular story that stands out to you most?
Well, Sarah, I would like to say my favorite stories involve the incredible women in my life. You remember my great-great-grandfather Boaz? Where you at, Boaz? I know you're here somewhere. Come on. How you doing, Boaz? Show us what you're made of. Do a little something. I mean, he's a stud. I know he doesn't want to show off for you guys, children. But good times. Yeah, good times. But I guess you'd have to say my most memorable stories are the ones where God shows up when I'm at my worst. Remorse and regret can leave quite a big impression on one's life. I was always the one who fought the enemy and did the rescuing. But there are times when I needed rescuing, and that was quite humbling. Those painful times allowed me to experience God's rescue and God's grace and mercy and loving kindness. I actually ended my song with those lyrics, not just because they rhyme, but because those words are very true.
Wow, that's humbling for us to hear. It's great to get your personal insight about Psalm 23 as well, because oftentimes, we might recite it, we will use it in different ways, and we don't often stop about it and think about it being part of your memories, part of your story in particular. There is a phrase that most anybody may not know the whole song or the whole song, but that one little phrase about the valley of the shadows or the valley of the shadow of death, that's a piece that just really grips people. What are you thinking when you think your mind?
Well, Pastor Jay, I get that a lot. I get that a lot. Basically, I'm talking about life. This entire life we live on this planet, we are in the valley of the shadow of death. Most of our life is actually spent there because the mountaintop experiences can be few and far between. The stories about me that God chose to include in the Bible are not a complete list of events of my entire life. Most of my days were actually spent just like yours, but a little different. I woke up, checked out some women, I ate, sat on the toilet, checked out some more women, finally fell asleep. The valley, though, can be safe and surrounded by God's love. It's a strong mountain fortress where death is only a mere shadow, a shadow that has no power over us. Think about it. A shadow is produced when a stream of light is projected onto any object. There are probably some examples around here. I'm not seeing any, but I'm sure there's some. Then the shadow is cast. God's light is always shining on us, or whatever is in our path, and produces only a shadow. The reality is, it is God's light. The shadow is nothing to be afraid of. The hurdle or obstacle we face may be real, but not impossible with God. There is peace in the valley. It's usually where the green grass and the still quiet waters are, but it can also be where we often get into the most trouble.
It's a very comforting explanation. Appreciate that. And part of that, to me, is it coincides with scary places. And you write something about we fear no evil. That's sort of where we sense evil in those shadows.
Well, you see, that can be true also. But as I said before, the quiet times and the normal routine days can be when our wandering get the best of us. And we often get into the most trouble. This is when evil often catches us off guard. The devil is an opportunist, of course. Remember, Adam and Eve were just enjoying the garden, and a day like all the others, when the tempter appeared, catching them off guard.
So I see your point. There's also those times, though, that we get so focused on the mountaintop experience that we neglect to see all the beauty that's around us in the valley. So it's reassuring hearing your words, and so that God provides for us, gives us abundant provisions as well.
Now you're catching on. God's rod and staff are how God guides us from danger and keeps us on the safe path. But we are sheep and we do tend to wander.
Speaking of paths, you wrote a phrase in that song about He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake.
Well, righteousness is faith. It is written. Abraham believed God, and he created it to him as righteousness. We not only are to believe in God, but we must believe God and God's promises. We believe that God is love, and God will never leave us nor forsake us. God's namesake, God's promise, God's covenant. The covenant is Jesus. Well, I guess that's a simple Cliff Notes answer, but
we'll take simple. So it's the valley. That's where we have these times to reflect over our lives, to see how God's in the midst of it all. But sometimes it's like, how do we see God's presence in that valley? How do we see and feel God stepping and walking with us in life? That seems to be a question for most of us. It's where is it that God is in the mix of our lives?
Well, it's something like that. Speaking of training, my brothers were such overachievers. They all had goals and worked so hard to pursue them. But me, I was considered the little dreamer boy. I will never forget the look on my brothers' faces when Samuel anointed me as king. I'm not sure which I was more excited about, becoming king or seeing their faces. They were pretty. As a boy, I often pretended to be King Saul, fighting the enemies of Israel in my fantasies. Of course I was never my brothers. I was the king leading them. Yeah. My imagination kept me entertained when I was alone with the sheep. That's to say the least.
Well, I suspect that day when Samuel showed up, your dream just sort of all came true then, didn't it? But as we read that narrative in the Bible, it didn't happen right away. And so, what was that like? All that waiting, those days of being a fugitive, of being like the future king fleeing and hiding and running away from the current king. And you ever wonder about Saul, whether he got the same memo that you did about being the future king?
Where is Saul, by the way? Where are you at, buddy? I know you're here somewhere. Come on. Saul, you are a strange human being. But he was God's anointed. But my goodness, you were predictable. It was quite fast. I didn't think someone could be so predictable, but here you are. That's fair. So many times it was in my reach to kill you, but somehow in my heart, that wasn't what I was supposed to do. Actually, sparing him, all those times helped me realize how many times God has spared me. Over and over again. And like Saul, I hate to say it, but I was also predictable. And often repeated the same mistakes over and over again. But God spared me numerous amounts of times. It was a lesson in grace and mercy for sure. Becoming king was more than the initial anointing. It required much more than I ever imagined as a boy. I mean, if you think about it, the stuff kings are made of requires a lot of time. I mean, a lot of time.
Well, as you speak of some of these events, there are some special folks here today who graciously agreed to help present your story each week.
Sure.
And as I sort of look around the room, if you are here and present, if you wouldn't mind standing as I call your name, and Mr. Steve Holman and Roscoe Killett participated and helped us out here. Jordan Slaymaker, I'm not Jordan is here today. Will Brown and Hannah Ray and Amanda Ray. We have Jacob Ray who's involved and helped us out. His grandmother Barbara Deering. Who else we got? We got Layla Pell was a part of that efforts. Goodness gracious. Bill and Nikki Retman. See how many people it takes to tell your story? Just cast a thousand. Young lady who has moved away from us at this point, Maria Dingbaum. We have Ruth Ann and Gary Casilius, and we have Ruth Ann's Iowa dance team. Who's not with us today, but was with us a few weeks ago. Glenn Stockwell was back here to help us out a lot. We've got Lori Walters and Mike McClanahan who have helped us out with technical stuff. And this morning we've got Carly Burks pushing down buttons. And then we have, there's somebody behind the scenes who puts pen to paper and uses her imagination. That's pretty good, right? So we want to mention that Alan Winter is involved in that effort as well, and just a whole host of characters. So we give you thanks for that.
Well, I would like to personally thank all of you too. I especially want to thank my dynamic duo. Where are you at, Clayton? My dynamic duo, I love that kid. Thank you so much for standing in for me while I was away doing my business. You danced your little heart out in front of the Lord, and I hope in there you can see yourselves too. In the stories that were presented, that is what makes them so timeless. The actual day those events occurred was very transformational. It was like the day I faced Goliath. Everything around me just disappeared, and it was just me and God. That, my friends, is what you call holy ground.
Holy ground. Well, I think that's a pretty good way to sum up all of your story, as well as God's story through the children of Israel. And all of these stories and the fun that we had hearing them, presenting them, and being a part of it, I think that's holy ground for us too. And I think our cup overflows
I see what you did there. No, it didn't go over the top of my head. Great to know you get my drift, though. I would also like to thank the amazing band Skillet for my killer tune as I made my way down the aisle. I wish I could have played that song each time I walked in the battle because it was just so riveting, so empowering. It just gets you going. Gets the blood pumping. Yeah.
Well, in conclusion of all of this, is there one thing you'd like for all of us to remember about you?
Well, what isn't there to not remember? Well, if I'm being non-hysterical, that I am a child of God, just like all of you. That I also had some shared struggles in family drama. At times, more people disliked me, surprisingly, than liked me. As a matter of fact, some people, including my own children, hated me. And I screwed up royally. You guys see? But God always restored me, even until my final days. It's God, knowing me and knowing what I love so dearly. Bingo. He knew it was one of my weaknesses, so in my very last days, the man above gifted me with this young and very beautiful and just, I don't know how to explain it, but this young Shunammite girl just to, snuggle with me, keep me warm, I can't do that, homeostasis is kind of let itself go, so. There's nothing about me that God doesn't already know. He knew me whilst I was being knit together in my mother's womb. But God does love me, and He loves all of you.
The thought crosses my mind, and we don't have music to actually sing the song, but maybe you could help walk us through. We've got a version of your song printed in our bulletin, and maybe you could sort of lead us as we all read it together?
Absolutely. It's been a while, I kind of...
Well, it's not the original language, so I might have struggled with the English.
For sure. All right. You, Lord, are my shepherd. You let me rest in fields of green grass. You lead me to streams of peaceful water, and you refresh my life. You are true to your name, and you lead me along the right paths. I may walk through valleys as dark as death, but I won't be afraid. You are with me, and your shepherd's rod makes me feel safe. You treat me to a feast while my enemies watch. You honor me as your guest, and you fill my cup until it overflows. Your kindness and love will always be with me each day of my life, and I will live forever in your house.
Well, David, thank you for being with us, taking time to share with us and to teach us. On behalf of myself and the parish of St. James, we thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Now, if you excuse me, I gotta make my way back to the land of the pirates.